British consulate in Hong Kong who went missing during a trip to mainland China. Simon Cheng Mankit was reportedly detained while trying to cross back into Hong Kong from Shenzhen. He'd been on a business trip and has now been missing for 12 days. Beijing says it's unaware of the case. Let's get more on this with political analyst Ross Feingold, who joins us now from Taipei. So what do you make of this, Ross? The fact that a British consulate employee who comes from Hong Kong has apparently been detained in China. Do you think it's related to the protests in Hong Kong?
Well, we could only speculate. Obviously, there's been some cases in recent weeks where China has been looking at people in Hong Kong who did participate in the protests and taking action against them. We've seen that most prominently with the Cathay Pacific airline, where Hong Kong companies were forced to take action against employees, pretty much at the behest or the order of China. People who have protest materials have been stopped at the border crossings if there's something in their personal belongings. So clearly China is watching people who get involved with the protests and people who get arrested or people who are on television. And we don't know whether or not this gentleman was involved in any of those events. We also don't know who else he may have met in China that caused the Chinese authorities to detain him. He went to China for a very legitimate reason, which was related to the business of the UK consulate in Hong Kong. So the purpose of his trip, as far as we know, was legitimate, but we don't know what triggered this Chinese response. And there's always the possibility that it could be random, that China is showing its anger at statements made by the UK government, along with other Western governments, with regard to the protests. And it wouldn't be the first person associated with the diplomatic community who's not necessarily a diplomat or have diplomatic immunity, because this man does not, being a locally hired employee. But we've seen this before, most prominently with Canadians who've been detained in China, who had associations such as working for non-government organizations that were funded by the Canadian government. So any kind of association with a foreign government that China is targeting could make someone susceptible to this detention.
Well, can China afford worsening relations with the UK right now? Because you mentioned relations with Canada there. It's also got terrible relations right now with Washington.
Well, there's certainly a war of words between spokesperson or media in China and the response from the UK government to recent events in Hong Kong. There's also more action by the UK to work with the United States and other like-minded countries with regard to the South China Sea and other issues that the global community does have its concerns, to put it lightly, about Chinese behavior. So for China to target the UK, we shouldn't be surprised. If relations worsen, we shouldn't be surprised, although that's also weighed against a new prime minister. China could be testing him. He's actually said some very positive things about what he wants out of at least the trade relationship with China. So, in some ways, Boris Johnson is being tested by the Chinese government as well.
Meanwhile, of course, protests continuing in Hong Kong. How is this affecting the whole region, and how worried is China about the impact beyond the Hong Kong borders?
Well, as we often see here in Asia, when issues of internal dispute, domestic political disputes, elections occur, protests in the streets, it's more common for Asian governments not to comment on the internal affairs of their neighbors. So we actually don't see many governments in Asia voicing any kind of support for the protesters, probably much to the disappointment of the protesters. Although here in Taiwan, where I'm speaking from today, that's a rare example of a government in Asia that's actually been very outspoken in support of democracy and the demands of the protesters. But China has an enormous amount of influence from trade or due to other reasons with governments in Asia. And again, this historical reluctance not to interfere in their neighbors' affairs. So we haven't seen much, at least officially. But of course, there are NGOs and democracy and human rights advocacy groups that try to make their support for the Hong Kong protesters known.
Ross, thank you. Ross Feingold in Taipei there. The US Secretary of State has criticised the release of an Iranian oil tanker in the Mediterranean.